Hello and a warm welcome to our last session, which is actually an academic lecture on international technology competition. We are extremely pleased and honored to have with us today Keyu Jin. Keyu Jin is a professor of economics at the London School of Economics and holds a PhD from Harvard University, and of course has also experience at various international organizations such as the World Bank, the IMF, and also some central banks such as the New York Fed and the Bank of England. Her research focuses on international macro, but also on the Chinese economy and more recently on technological development and technological competition. The idea of the academic lecture is to first listen to Dr. Keyu Jin for about half an hour to make her argument and give her presentation. So she has a PowerPoint presentation. And after that, my colleague Scott Marcos, who is a senior fellow here at Bruegel, will react to some of what we will have heard, and we will engage in a conversation with her. And of course, we also do want to engage with you, our esteemed audience. So if you want to ask a question, please type in the Slido code BAM21 competition, and I can take a few questions at the end for Keyu. Thank you so much, Keyu Jin, for joining us today. I think you are right now in China, actually, and we very much look forward to your lecture on this very important topic about technological competition.
Thank you so much. It's really a great pleasure to be presenting some of my work at this meeting. From China, related to China, but also related to a great number of questions around the world. Let me just be able to share my screen. Does everyone see that? Just checking. Okay, I don't hear anything, so I'm assuming that is a yes.
Yes, now we can see it. Thank you.
Right.
Yes, and I think they are pulling down a screen here in the auditorium. I'm not sure whether we will get. Yeah, now we have the presentation on the big screen actually, so we see you very well.
Perfect. Perfect. Great. So a watershed moment that had marked what appears to many people as a technological Cold War between the U.S. and China. Was the ban on a few Chinese technology companies, notably Huawei and ZTE, during Trump's presidency, followed by threats to ban the super apps and hugely popular apps, WeChat and TikTok. President Biden removed some of these companies from the blacklist, but added a number of his own, making about 60 companies, 60 Chinese technological companies banned from US investment. Now, in another move, very recently, the Chinese government has come in to crack down on the technological sector, including many in the education sector and various big internet digital companies, those in ride hailing, in delivery and e-commerce and gaming. Around the world, various governments are thinking about how to rein in big tech at various paces. So these are really interesting issues that we have observed around technological companies, especially digital companies, that have hitherto not received as much attention, but really are front and center issues these days. It seems at odds with the desire, on the one hand, to win a technological race between these big rivals, and other hand, to really focus on the domestic set of issues, protecting consumer welfare, at the same time trading off against efficiency gains. How do we think about the scope of international competition in the contemporary world of technology companies? How are they different from the industrial companies competition of the past? And what can governments do? These are questions I want to evoke during this talk, and I want to offer some initial conjectures and responses from part of our ongoing research. But more importantly, it is to really share with you a set of framework and some tools to think about how we might actually dig deeper into the deeper mechanisms of technological competition, be able to distinguish and differentiate a number of these technological companies so that it can better inform us of what optimal policy should be, what entrepreneurs should do, and what the ultimate outcome of competition is likely to depend on. So with that, let me start with a few data points, and so a few observations, which is that this is the world's largest largest companies by market cap in 2008. As you can see, only one company, Microsoft, made it to the top a few companies list, with a few two Chinese companies, but those are big SOEs in telecom and oil. 10 years later, the majority of them are internet companies, and 2 of them are actually Chinese. Now, if we look at, so this is the 10 largest internet companies by revenue. We have, almost half being Chinese and American, with e-commerce companies like JD.com, of course, Alibaba, Tencent, initial gaming company, but now really social media company that owns WeChat. And if we look at the top 25 internet companies by market cap, around 11 of them are Chinese. I think 13 or so are American. Only a couple more are from other countries. So they're really dominated by the US and China. And if we look at unicorn companies, which is private companies valued at $1 billion or more, the US leads with 228 as of June 2020, followed by China, and then subsequently much fewer in other countries. If the first thing you think about is size, then India and Brazil are quite large, but again they are far from proportionally matching up to the scale of the Chinese or the Americans in terms of technological companies. And here's a graph about Europe. What this shows is that in terms of the largest technology companies by valuation, larger than $5 billion or more, the EU is lagging. EU as a whole is lagging behind China and the US. Although in terms of the smaller ones at the scale of $1 to $2.5 billion valuation, EU has many more in comparison relative to what it has for the larger technological companies. And this is something to think about of, why have there not been these tremendously big tech companies arising from Europe, even though if we think of it as, together as an integrated large economy. The second observation I want to make, and that will relate to how we think we should think about government policy and the scope of international competition, is that we can't really treat all these digital technology companies as the same. These large internet, especially consumer internet companies, look very different when it comes to market equilibrium, how many firms exist, what is the scope of competition, etc. They are very different. For instance, in ride hailing, the ride hailing industry, China has Didi dominated by Didi, US dominated by Uber and Lyft. These are predominantly 1 or 2 companies in each country, but worldwide, as we'll see, there are many other local players. By contrast, if you look at search industry, really there's only really one dominant company in the world, and it's Google. It is Baidu in China, but that's because of restrictions on Google in China. But if we look at an industry like e-commerce, again, there will be some dominant players like Amazon, Alibaba, but also many quite strong local players, sometimes even dominating the market. And of course, social media, we have a number of global players as well. And so in terms of, so this is kind of an initial motivation to kind of remind us that there are differences even among internet companies, and we should treat them differently. So we'll go into a bit more as to why they might look different. So this is the kind of questions I've laid out that I'd like to address. But before we go into the details of these elaborations, the first thing to ask is, what is really different between today's internet technology companies and some of the wider technology companies compared to traditional industrial companies? What's the main difference? And that, again, will ultimately shape the structure of the economy and what policy should be thinking about. I think one very distinct difference is the shift from a production-based cost to a customer acquisition-based cost model. So, in the past, if we made shoes, we made a certain number of shoes, an optimal number of shoes, such that marginal cost equal to marginal benefit, and you would stop at that point. And today, many of these companies, they have very, very low marginal cost of production, or almost zero cost of delivery, marginal cost of delivery. Think about Netflix and Spotify. And it's the same amount of cost to produce something for 100 customers versus 100,000 customers versus 10 million customers. And so the bottleneck is no longer on production, but really how many customers you can acquire. So when we talk about something going viral, it is very low customer acquisition cost. And based on that kind of model, the expansion of the firm, the company, the growth of the company is very, very different from a traditional industrial company or manufacturing company, for that matter. And the second difference is that the nature of increasing returns to scale has changed. Scale matters. Scale matters for internet technology companies. As we've seen, China and US are notably different because of their size. And of course, in the past, industrial companies also had increasing returns to scale possibly, but the nature has dramatically changed. Here, we have the notion that bigger is better. Okay, the bigger you are, the more customers you have, the more data you have, the more suppliers is on your platform, the more efficient and more productive you become. This is a different notion of increasing returns based on, let's say, fixed cost when you build an airplane, or such analogies. So if we think about Chinese company Ctrip, which is kind of like booking online travel services, as I discussed with their founder and CEO, he distinctly said, look, the more customers we have, the faster we learn and much better we become, better services and better products. And for a company like Amazon or Alibaba, the fact that they can have lots of suppliers on their platform, potentially can even reduce markups for customers, and that is an efficiency gain. Of course, more data, more information makes the matching also better. So there's the notion that the more customers or that you have, the more productive and efficient you become. And relatedly, labor is no longer an essential factor in expanding output. Maybe you need labor to produce something first, but then selling more and more units require low labor cost. Discussion of all these implications, the full scale of these implications on interest rate, on investment, on inequality across different groups of labor and employment is beyond the scope of our talk. But the fact that today's internet companies are so different is really has really profound consequences on the economy as a whole, but also on the scope of international competition. The old idea the idea that we have is the market being a natural regulator in the traditional kind of economy versus the new economy is something that is also different. Here, with low customer acquisition cost, and really very strong increasing returns to scale, there might be no natural limits to growth for these internet technology companies as there were for traditional in the companies in the traditional economy. So the new economy has some very different features, including whether the market can itself regulate and kind of limit the boundaries of the firm, or whether there really should be increasing scope for the government to intervene. And lastly, another feature is the economies of scope. The idea that somehow by producing or making one thing, you become better at making another. And this is one reason we might be seeing these big super apps or platform economies emerging on the horizon, whether it's Amazon or here's a graphical depiction of Alibaba's ecosystem, where we have Alibaba's e-commerce platforms, Tmall, but this is Ant Financial, the payments arm. But Alibaba's ecosystem, we have the food delivery service, we have pharmaceuticals, we have logistics, we have Ali Film. I don't even know all of these and what they represent. Of course, Ali Cloud, and all of that is in part of Alibaba's ecosystem. They also have, like Amazon, their own kind of Whole Foods grocery delivery. And of course, with other people are familiar with the whole entire empire of Amazon. Now, it is possible that after a while, a company like Alibaba that has acquired 800 million customers, the marginal growth of the company getting on based on additional customers is going to be much smaller than if it were to expand the products and services that it can offer to the customers already on the platform. So then it starts to grow horizontally. But the idea that there's economies of scope suggests that by being good at making one thing or offering one thing, you are also good at making another thing, completely different thing. So I'm not sure we really believe that the fact that Amazon knows that I like to buy green vacuum cleaners means that it can suggest the kind of books that I would like on Kindle. So is this really a reflection of efficiency, which would kind of justify these economies of scope arguments, or is it a matter of really true monopoly, unprecedented power, monopoly power, because of the expansion, the type of expansions of these companies? So here is some very briefly, some data to capture the fact that the market structure is very different now, or very different across these internet companies. We can see with Google, this is the market share of Google, almost 90%. This is the market share of Baidu in China, which is around 70%. And especially it picked up after Google started to decline, after there were restrictions of Google's activities in China. Baidu really became the dominant search engine in China. But in terms of the world, this is where Google stands, above 80%. And there's really, in this market, there's really one dominant firm. But compared to, let's say, e-commerce, the e-commerce market, there are several players, not just one, and there are several global players, but also several local players. So for instance, in China, this is Alibaba's Tmall, JD.com, and the rising star PDD, Pinduoduo, which is kind of servicing lower income households, but really growing at a monstrous rate. And then on the other hand, in the US, Amazon is of course the dominant player, but eBay and Walmart also have quite significant market shares. And if you look at Indonesia, there's some very strong local players like Shopee or Tokopedia, and some Chinese ones, Bilibili and JD.com. I don't even see Amazon here. So these are local players that are dominating the market. Similarly with India, even though Amazon is still a major player, it is immediately followed by the market is split with a local player, Flipkart. In terms of ride hailing, this is a map of the global expansion of Uber and Didi. First of course, Didi dominates China and Uber dominates North America. But in terms of third markets, whether it is Latin America or Africa, this is the striped one is Didi proxies or Uber proxies. And if you look at Russia, which is dominated by a local player, really, it's really an open it's open competition. Didi was initially had it was behind Uber, of course, in Latin America, which is America's backyard. But very, very quickly, it was able to surmount a lot of the local, or it was able to kind of really become aggressively competitive, and many of these Latin American economies even overtaking Didi in some of them. Uber in some of them. But if we look at the overall picture in the world, again, Uber and Didi are the dominant players here. If we look at how many countries they're in and how much revenue they have, but there are a bunch of other really very strong local players. Notably, Grab in Southeast Asia is something that is a dominant player, and Ola, etc. So again, all of this is to say that these markets look very different. And very lastly, social media. We have all kinds of different kinds of products, right? Facebook is, of course, the dominant one. But then when we talk about, when we look at social messenger, there's WhatsApp, but there's also a bunch of other possibilities. Now, China, in all of these categories has its own dominant player, and some of them has been able to expand a bit globally, but definitely have their own kind of dominant player. But then if we look at TikTok, and Telegram, etc. Again, there are quite a few players in this market as well. So all of this is to say the structure of the economy or the market looks different from one another across different industries. And global telecom is a little bit like the Google industries, with really only 3 or 4 dominant companies around the world, and these are global companies. So how do we explain it? And the reasons why they look different might also inform us of how we should think about government policies when it shapes international competition. The first reason is what we call global versus local externality. Everyone's familiar with the idea of externalities, but the fact that some of it could be global. For instance, the best example is Google. It becomes better the more worldwide used. Amazon, it also has a lot of global externalities with the major suppliers around the world and linking customers and suppliers. But by contrast, if you look at very strong local externalities, ride sharing has some degree of local externality. You have to build again your business domestically, and there's some domestic features that are culturally different, or in terms of rules and regulations, customization, all make it somewhat different. And of course, on the other extreme, if you think about online service bookings, it's overwhelmingly local. What people like in the area, what restaurants are locally available and services are locally available. So if we kind of summarize this in this box, some have very strong both global externality and local externality. I mean, e-commerce and ride sharing, there's some global technologies that can go across their products, but also very strong local externalities. Whereas on the other extreme, search engine versus online service bookings span the other range and spectrum. Another reason could be just the fact that these products are different. They're imperfectly substitutable. Facebook is different from Instagram, which is different from TikTok, which is different from WhatsApp and WeChat. They're used differently. Different groups of people use them for different purposes. And so the fact that they can coexist is potentially a reflection of the fact that they're not perfectly substitutable. Whereas, you have highly substitutable or uniform goods such as search engine, 5G equipment. Again, that can explain why, that can explain why in one competitive landscape, there could be many players versus only a few in another landscape. So just a brief recap of what is important for international competition. First of all, in terms of especially the internet digital companies that we focused on so far, big is important. Customer acquisition can give you really an initial first mover advantage. But we do need to make differences among industry characteristics. When we think about what is China good at and what is the US good at, maybe at the very high level, China might be better at making kind of homogenous and anonymous goods that don't require a lot of cultural, appeal, but really kind of things that are highly substitutable. 5G, AI, blockchain, etc., are areas where of course China is also already very advanced. The predominance of local content, who is better at penetrating local markets, adapting and localizing. The story of Didi I thought was very interesting in Brazil. They had a very different approach in tackling the market compared to Uber. Even though the US and Latin America are in some ways, closer culturally, Didi really went after what is the local customs. Uber took the model that they had in the US and wanted to try to apply it in different markets and expand very quickly without much local customization. But for instance, Uber went around and tried to link all the local banks with its app to create a payment function. It even provided services like opening bank accounts for Didi's drivers because they had no bank accounts. They understood local customs, such as the Brazilian drivers are more eager to get their pay sooner rather than later. So they get paid on a weekly level rather than a monthly level. So Chinese companies did a lot more of the grunt work versus the other approach, which is to expand very quickly and use their superior technology in various countries. So these all make for differences in shaping the international competition outcome, but the government also plays a very big role. Now, the key here is what should the government do? This is somewhat familiar discussion, but much more nuanced and complex, given that there's a set of differences and distinctions among these kind of companies. First of all, they want to restrict big tech because you want to have more technology companies in your market, so that increases consumer gains from lower markups and encouraging entry and competition. But because there are very strong increasing returns to scale here, scale is so important, you might want to harness these returns by keeping as few number of companies as possible. Think about Google making it really, really big and let it have all the data and all the customers and make it highly efficient, rather than imposing that there has to be a few search companies in the economy. You make it one. Same thing with Huawei in 5G in China, which benefited from being, having very little competition. So this is a trade-off, but the trade-off also changes when we think about the international economy, right? When we think about the fact that these companies can go abroad and earn revenue and acquire international customers and become even more efficient. So if you want a company like, let's say, Didi to be internationally successful, maybe the right thing to do is to restrict domestic competition, make it there be only one Didi and let it win the technological race. Rather than trying to have multiple Didis. So the scope of that the policy or the contours of the policy does change when we think about international competition. Now, of course, here we're strictly thinking about economic terms, efficiency. We're not taking into account issues of national security, data protection, data security, which are, of course, at the top of the minds of some of these government bodies. That's not, that those will be also critical factors in determining this. So this is why we see somewhat, kind of odds, these actions being at odds with each other. On the one hand, you want to make your companies globally competitive so they can become better and bigger. On the other hand, you want to restrict, you want to rein them in for your domestic consumer welfare. Lastly, in just 2 minutes, let me just make some general comments about technological competition more broadly, rather than the internet digital competitions companies that we focused about so far. We do know a lot about trade. I don't think there's an equivalently depth of knowledge about the framework of international competition in technology, especially today's technological companies. But what we do know from another set of work that we're also pursuing is that the government can actively promote a developing country's technology, sometimes at the cost of, the advanced economy's welfare. So the government can actively promote an innovation policy to reverse a country's comparative advantage. And in fact, it's optimal to do so. So if China was not good at making cars, it was not its comparative advantage, the government should actively promote innovation in the car industry to reverse that. And the consequence of that eventually will be hurtful or welfare reducing for Americans or Europeans. So the bottom line is that optimal policy is not to do nothing. We shouldn't think about in this a world of technology and trade and competition that the government should just be playing a very passive role. We have strong reasons to believe that it is even worthwhile to sacrifice production and consumption in the short run to allocate production of research and innovation to advance some of the comparative disadvantaged sectors and to tax this comparative sector. This eventually will hurt the other countries' welfare. Again, we're not taking global welfare into account. We're taking national welfare into account, and this is actually the optimal policy to do. So this kind of argument has not really been highly resonating in the past, but coming to the fore because we're entering a new era of technological rivalry, because we have a very strong competitor that is China, that is different in many other ways as a developing country, and so this is some kind of a general framework to start to think about some of these issues. And I'm sure that as we plow further, there will be deeper and more complex issues to grapple with. So thank you. Let me stop here and turn to the next.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much, Keyu. This was very clear. We could also hear you very clearly and loudly, and so it was a very clear presentation on, of course, a crucial issue. And of course, I think the ending in particular will be quite controversially discussed. I think has a lot of big implications, what you said at the end. And let me remind our audience, if you want to ask questions, please go on Slido and type in the code BAM21 competition. But before I take questions from the audience, let me give the floor to my colleague Scott Marcos to
okay, sounds like my mic is live. That's good. First, I'd like to thank Professor Keyu Jin for a very, very clear and comprehensive presentation. I think that she laid out an awful lot of issues exceptionally clearly. What we heard was a great deal about what's right with digital platforms in the United States and with China. You didn't hear a lot of names of EU-based companies in that presentation, for good reason. What I would like to expand on briefly is a bit about what's known about why we don't have successful global platforms to any significant degree based in the EU. And I would argue here an awful lot of what's holding EU companies up is not new. An awful lot of this has been known for a long time. It's natural to start with the question of market fragmentation, We also heard a little bit about this from the Facebook speaker in one of the previous panels. That can't be the whole story for reasons that Professor Yin made also clear. A lot of the companies actually operate with global rather than local externalities. Google, Facebook, Amazon, they don't seem to have a lot of problems with fragmentation of the European market. Presumably a Europe-based firm wouldn't have either. So the fragmentation is an issue. China has a huge domestic market. The United States also has a very large domestic market. It's an issue, it's not the dominant issue, or perhaps certainly not the only issue. A well-known problem over many years has been lack of finance for EU startup companies. On startups, the European Union does really reasonably well in comparison with the United States. Small startups, they have trouble scaling up. They have trouble gaining access to finance. As we've heard in previous panels, Europe tends to be banking heavy and capital market light. That's especially true when we look at venture capital, where the United States has many times as much venture capital as the European Union. So that represents a key limitation. The EU has been aware of this. They do small things, but it seems to nibble at the edge of the problem. Fundamentally, some real much larger structural reforms would seem to be needed. Difficulty in implementing initial public offerings, IPOs, is another issue. They're pretty hard in most European countries. Most of those that took place within the former EU took place in the UK, which is no longer EU. That doesn't help the situation either. So again, with a founder trying to bring the company up to a more efficient scale, and what Professor Yin made very clear, scale is everything in a lot of these businesses. Trying to scale them up is really hard in Europe, needs a much more aggressive approach, not clear actually what could be done. Another issue that tends not to get as much attention as I think it deserves is bankruptcy laws in various European member states that tend to be very diverse and in many cases really oppressive and a significant impediment. If you look at the United States, a lot of the successful startups are done on the second or third try by entrepreneurs. In Europe, these bankruptcy laws mean that the people and the resources tend to get tied up for long periods of time after a failed enterprise. So these are all issues. Switching a bit, I'd like to come to one of the points that Professor Yin raised right at the beginning, which is this global conversation about what the right way is to regulate and govern these large-scale technological platforms. And here we see substantial movement in all the major regions of the world. We see a big change in the United States, big changes now in China, and certainly in the European Union as well. Here in the EU, we see a focus on a Digital Markets Act and a Digital Services Act that try to beef up competition law and prevent certain kinds of abuse, also an AI regulation. In the United States, after many years of very laissez-faire permissive policy, we see now an executive order on competition from the Biden administration, and we see at least a half dozen different legislative proposals going through the Congress. Some come from Republicans, some come from Democrats. They tend to dislike the tech platforms for different reasons, but it's possible, again, after many years where laissez-faire policy toward the platforms was almost religion, suddenly it's looking likely that we'll actually see some shifts. And these shifts are likely to address issues like killer acquisitions, for example, acquisitions to prevent small companies from reaching the stage where they could become effective competitors. To me, one of the most interesting sets of development, though, is the one that Professor Yin referred to at the beginning, which is that we see a substantial change and a substantial increased emphasis on many of the same topics from the PRC government just in the last, say, 8 months, I'd say most notably since December. Some of these issues, like consumer privacy, had been on the agenda for a while, but moving slowly. Suddenly, they're really jumping. And I think a question has to be why. One possible explanation is the PRC thought the tech platforms were getting too powerful and had to crack down. Another has to do with enhancing the capability of national security. And a third really relates to a general interest in consumer welfare. Most of the Western press has tended to focus on the first. I personally think that's a little too simplistic. I think the others, including the interest in consumer welfare, are likely also a factor. What we've seen over the last 6-8 months, we've seen a new privacy law very similar to the EU GDPR in its broad concepts. We saw that introduced. It's hard to see a rationale for doing that solely as a means of trying to put a rambunctious entrepreneur like Jack Ma in his place. So I think that there are other things going on there too that are hard for someone who's outside the system to really see. But privacy is becoming more of an issue in regulation in all of these countries, also in the United States, where there are many individual privacy laws but no general framework. So these are issues. I guess as a last thought, there isn't a global discussion as well. For example, there's a WTO plurilateral initiative on e-commerce. The natural question is it possible to get consensus there on anything between, again, the key players being the United States, the EU, and China? I wouldn't rule it out. As I said, I think the Chinese have interest in some of these topics. Notable is their interest in privacy is different in one key respect, which also to some extent applies to the EU. Even if there's a focus on privacy, it doesn't relate to government privacy. Within the EU, one could make almost the same claim. In any case, if you look at the examples, though, China did sign up to a privacy clause in the RCEP. I think it's possible that there might be agreement on something, but the more inclusive it is, the less strong it could be. And with that, back over to you, Guntram.
Thank you, Scott. There was a lot of material in what you said also, and I do want to give Keyu a chance to react to a few of those points, the privacy point, but also the more recent crackdown on some of the Chinese big tech companies, which is also a comment by one of my colleagues in the audience, Mario Mariniello, who's really also asking very much about this crackdown on the big tech, which is quite different actually to that in the Western world, at least when judging by market capitalization. So market capitalization of some of the Chinese big tech has been in significant decline in the last couple of months, while you couldn't say that of some of those big data firms in the Western world. So perhaps you can comment on that point, but also on the privacy point. I think we would be very interested to hear your views.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for your comments. First of all, just before some of the questions that Guntram raised, I think the EU question is very interesting. Of course, the variety of reasons that could possibly shaping these differences is all very important. I just wanted to add another one, and maybe a little bit provocatively, what if there was more government protection or restrictions on foreign big tech or big firms coming into a country? For instance, India is another example that had all the scale and the local advantage of developing their own social media app and ride hailing, or in particular messaging, but Facebook and WhatsApp are the dominant players in their economy, whereas if they had more government restrictions, it's very possible that the local super app would have emerged very rapidly and done very well. And the same thing in Europe, if there was not this very quick aggressive move of Uber, it might well be that there was a European ride-hailing company that would have that first mover advantage. So I just wonder whether, if we're talking about pure efficiency point of view, whether some of these government restrictions would have been helpful. On the other issues related to Chinese kind of crackdown of the technology sector, let's call it that way, if it can be put that way, is very interesting. There are multiple fold reasons. So I think, starting from the obvious, politically, technological companies becoming too big that is able to wield political influence would be seen as a threat. But this is by no means the only or even the main reason for reining in technological companies. I think there is a genuine concern for privacy. You might be surprised about that in a place like China. But in fact, consumers have been increasingly anxious and concerned about how their data is used. And the Chinese government is actually very responsive to their citizens' needs, actually in many ways much more responsive and more accountable to their citizen needs than many even democracies, let's say. So there's a genuine concern for that, and also the government has punished a number of these big tech companies that have been caught misusing the data, but also manipulating consumer interests and exploiting consumers in a number of ways. Of course, there's no doubt that many of these big companies have very big social contributions and to consumer interests, but at the same time, there have been some misconduct, illicit misconduct, and the government certainly has the good intention of trying to weed those out. Why now is an interesting question. There are a couple reasons. One is that the usual approach the government likes to take when there's a new expanding sector is to let you do your thing first, innovate first with a lot of autonomy, even if it's skirting regulations and on the border, and then coming in to regulate you after they have observed that you have matured and after clearly identifying what the problems are. This was even true with the P2P platforms that became a huge headache, but initially they let them expand and kind of grow boundlessly and very rapidly. So now some of these issues are becoming increasingly clear. And China is already, quite the leader of the pack in many of these internet digital companies. There could also be another reason, which is to shift some of these resources allocated to these big tech companies into what is more needed for research funding and resources in the high-tech areas, critical components areas where China is still lagging and wants to close the gap with advanced countries like the US. But privacy and data leakage is a very important issue here, even in the realm of the international. In the international realm, it's the same thing. Foreign companies would have to abide by very strict data protection laws, privacy laws, when operating in China. What kind of data can be transferred across borders, what kind of data would be critical and might affect national security, what could put China at a disadvantage compared to the other international competitors are all concerns. But to answer that question more generally, I think the Chinese model has shifted a bit away from just growth and GDP into consumer welfare, a little bit less about efficiency and a bit more about responding to citizens' need, the standards of living, which includes a much broader set of measures than just economic welfare.
Wonderful. I mean, just to sort of push you a little bit more on your thinking about the European Union, which I think you've answered already quite a bit the issues raised by Scott, but still, I mean, this notion of restricting access to your domestic market to allow a domestic ecosystem for example, ride sharing to develop and to acquire the scale. Would be quite a change to, I think, the traditional approach that authorities have taken in Europe. Also, because I think the notion of consumer welfare and having early on services available, good services available, resonates very strongly with citizens. Or put it differently, I mean, it would have been very difficult to restrict access to, I don't know, Google or Uber on the grounds of hoping that some European alternative would develop later on. So can you and then let's say you do that, and then you develop those companies. But then, afterwards, it seems to me that now, is there perhaps some sort of regret even in China by dialing back and, now having a strong crackdown on these companies, which I think, as Scott is saying, probably goes a bit beyond, pure market arguments. So I mean, I'm still, I have to say, struggling with the policy recommendation of restricting openness to develop your own companies, and then all of a sudden have very little domestic competition, which then raises issues on its own. So can I just push you a little bit more on this front?
Sure, of course. I think these are excellent questions. I mean, one of the things that I wanted to emphasize in this presentation is that we need to treat these international internet companies very differently, these technology companies very differently. For instance, protecting a company that has purely local externalities seems to make very little sense, right? There's no kind of local services providers. Having only one makes little sense because they wouldn't have that kind of competitive edge internationally anyways by the nature of the industry. So it's not to say we should do the same thing for all internet companies. But think about another example, which is 5G or chips or semiconductors or artificial intelligence or these high tech, cutting edge technologies, which we might think are a bit different from the internet companies that we gave as examples, including Google. First of all, you really might want to have a first mover advantage, because it's not just about getting as many customers as possible. It's about developing potentially, well, first of all, it's about potentially grabbing a large amount of market share and being able to keep it for a long period of time. And also in terms of maybe creating a general purpose technologies being those kind of technologies that have spillovers into other industries in the economy or can shape technologies in the future, or determine technological standards. These seem to have efficiency gains or productivity gains or gains even beyond that that are much wider in scope and than the kind of consumer-facing internet companies that we mentioned. This would not be very different from the kind of industrial policies that many countries pursued on their development path with a variety of tools. I mean, the tools out there are multiple. Maybe it's not explicit limiting access. There are a variety of tools, whether it's export tariffs or taxes or even active domestic policies like allocating researchers into certain industries is the kind of the point that I made in the very last slides. A range of tools to harness that first mover advantage. So I guess the point, and I'm not giving any clear definite answers here, but the first observation is that these technology companies are very different, and the nature of their differences can shape different policies. So we shouldn't treat them the same. But maybe when we talk about a technology like 5G, there are much stronger interest for the government to do something about foreign restrictions or protection than compared to other internet companies.
Right. We have lots of questions, additional questions coming in. So let me just take them perhaps in 2 or 3 from our audience, so that you get a chance to have as many questions as possible. So I think one set of questions is around regulation. So 2 of our colleagues, Lionel Genreau and Mia Hoffmann, ask about tech regulation, privacy regulation, but also algorithmic transparency and the obligation to counter misinformation. Do these kind of regulation ultimately hamper the emergence of new players? And what's your overall welfare assessment as regards these regulation? I mean, are they in the end beneficial for welfare, or rather negative because they prevent the emergence of these kind of companies? I think Pauline Weil is asking in a very same direction. I mean, is there a trade-off in applying regulations that could curtail a tech firm growth and ambitions of having national tech firms with a global presence?
Yes, I think unequivocally there is a trade-off, right? I think data protection and privacy, who should be getting the data or who should be owning the data? Should firms be able to share the data, should firms pay for the data? All of these, I think, does invoke a set of very important trade-offs. Particularly because of the nature of these very strong increasing returns to data that all of these companies can gain efficiency and also shape competition by restricting data flows, etc. And also the rise of new firms. So I think this is the key question here, which is consumer protection versus efficiency. And by the way, governments have very different tastes for data protection, although China, as we mentioned, is catching up and becoming more holding the same kind of sentiment as the EU than before. But this is the trade-off. So on what spectrum are you standing? Now, we used to think that China might be much bigger on efficiency and less on data protection and also more on international competition, but it doesn't look like it's necessarily the case.
Let me ask one more question, and of course, Scott, if you want to come in with one last question as well, that would be also very helpful. Question here by Jürgen Michels. He's asking about the US-China conflicts. Does a further escalation of that conflict lead to a separation of technological standards beyond what we have, I guess? And does this hamper the progress in global digitalization? And Scott, do you want to perhaps come in with one remark before we give the last word to Keyu?
Sure. I think this is more in the line of a question. As I understood what you said most recently, it was you were advocating use of what I would consider protectionism, industrial policy, saying that it could be useful to promote a single technology provider for those that have global externalities in specific technologies. But I'm wondering, how do you choose those? There's always the risk that if this is done by the policymakers, there's always a substantial risk that they get this wrong. And also, what extent here do dual-use kind of technologies come into play? Technologies that could be used for military or surveillance purposes. 5G, of course, being an example. The Americans are absolutely panicked at realizing that they have no 5G producers. Thank you.
Great. Very lastly, I think US-China tensions are definitely spurring Chinese techno-nationalism, which invokes a all-out national mobilization of resources to develop independent technology, to be self-reliant, and to stray away from depending on American technologies, which was the assumption that it could be comfortably doing that for some time because of globalization. Now that has completely changed the course, and China is going indigenous technology. This also means internationally that I think, I don't know if decoupling would be the right word, there will be no convergence, but these two worlds could move in parallel with some overlap. But there could very well be, I can easily see a Chinese technological standard with an American technological standard. Of course, China might have the advantage of producing high quality but lower cost high tech, including cloud and equipment, telecom equipment that might be very popular for developing countries that might not see China's companies as a major national security threat. And we might well see these two parallel systems taking place in conjunction to still the exchange of flows of knowledge and researchers, et cetera, and collaboration. To Scott's question, how do you pick the winners? That's exactly, that's a really good question. I think Huawei is a good example of what happened in China, which is that there were lots of players initially. But when Huawei emerged to be highly successful or the leader of the pack, Then the Chinese government focused on helping Huawei. So selection first through market, and then a bit more protection and limiting competition, subsequently. Again, none of this is just purely economic arguments. Of course, we want to think broader about how much government intervention we really want to have. But this was the process, and it seemed to have worked in these areas in high tech. Military technology is often the starting point of high tech critical technologies. And here the U.S. and Israel are very good examples of that. I'm not sure how to precisely answer Scott's question, but turning military technologies into civilian technology also requires a different set of organizational powers. The Russia, the Soviet Union in particular was, relatively strong in military technology, but that couldn't really be converted into civilian technology. So that process, that smooth process that countries like the US was able to kind of foment, that horizontal vertical network that links businesses and universities and research labs and national defense programs, etc., I think was one of the reasons that it was able to really cross a lot of cross flow. And this is exactly what China is trying to do as well, is to merge the military and civilian technologies. And of course, the issue is raised on how technology is used for surveillance. Is it going to infringe on people's rights? Again, these are cultural issues that we're not going to get into today. But the Chinese, in return for safety and security, are sometimes more willing than you think to be contributing to the data for these purposes of social stability and safety. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Keyu, for your lecture, your academic lecture, for your remarks, for answering the questions, and of course for also raising at the end the cultural issues which we can't discuss more, but which of course play very strongly into the differences, into the different approaches to data protection and so on and so forth. So that's clearly a very big topic which is driven also by political differences in the political system. Thank you so much. It was a fascinating lecture, and I think really a fascinating topic also, and it was great to have you today with us from China. And thank you, Scott, also for your comments. And well, thank you to our audience, those that are here physically present, but also those online, for being with us at the Bruegel annual meeting. This is actually our last session. For those who are physically present, they have one goodie that the online people do not get, which is actually a little lunch waiting outside here in the sun, where we can have more conversations over a sandwich or a glass of water. Thank you so much to all of you, and thank you, Keyu, again. Bye-bye.
Pleasure. Bye.